I invite you all to join me in giving Harold a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, for that nice introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about the book that I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into. I just wanted to, the book has some history. This is the 4th edition that we're talking about. Just wanted to show you the 1st edition and look at it from this side. This is the 2nd edition. This is the 3rd edition. So 2nd edition was 2000, the 3rd edition was 2009, and this is the 4th edition, right? So you can see when we went from this to that, right? So a lot of knowledge went into that. And then finally, just last year, we have this edition, translated into Mandarin. So very pleased with that. And so I want to acknowledge my co-author, Fred Magdoff, who actually was the initiator of this project. And he is a professor emeritus at the University of Vermont. He retired about 10 years ago. Anyway, so a little bit about the book. This is the table of contents. I won't go into the detail. This book is not a textbook. It's not historical fiction or anything like that. We call it a handbook. It's a handbook published by the Sustainable Ag Research and Extension Program from the USDA. And they've been great to work with. And one of the advantages of that has been that we are able to basically make it available at a very low cost. So a paper copy of the book, I think right now it's $23. We're selling it there for $20 if you're interested. And it's been used in a lot of workshops as well because it has a nice bulk discount. So if you buy 20 copies for a workshop, you get 50% discount. As far as I know, there's been about 80,000 copies sold over the years, and about 1.5 digital, what do they call it? Digital accesses, which means somebody goes online because it's electronically available for free as a PDF. And so a digital access means somebody downloaded it or maybe just a chapter or something like that. So I'm going to be, you can see the different parts of the book. So the first one focuses on organic matter, because organic matter is such an important part of healthy soils. Then sort of about the processes, the important basic knowledge that you need to have around soils. And then part 3 really goes into the management of the soils. How do you take this information and manage soils, like things like cover cropping or reducing tillage or integrating crops and livestock, nutrient management, composting. And then the final part, the final chapters are basically how do you put it all together? How do you take this information? So the idea of this book, and it's kind of practitioner oriented, is that you read the book in its entirety, and it hopefully kind of opens your mind about what matters and what the processes are, what's important in the soil, and how do you then manage that in either an agricultural setting or an urban setting or whatever. Okay, so for this presentation, since it's almost like a course, and we only have 40 minutes, I decided that I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of this that I think is perhaps especially interesting also from an historical perspective. So, and sort of with that, so I have a lot of pictures, I think no graphs even, or maybe one. So with gratitude to my wife who's sitting there and my children who often sat in the car with me, and when I slammed the brakes and said, oh, look at that landslide or look at that crop, and then turned around and took the pictures. But over the years, I got a pretty nice collection of pictures. Okay, so soil. So what's soil all about? How do soils develop and form? So this is my version of it, very simplified. The soils are made of mineral particles. Mineral particles contain minerals or nutrients like phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, potassium, etc. Soil particles also have this wonderful ability to hold on to water through a process that we call capillarity. So soils behave like a sponge, right? So they can take in water, precipitation basically, and they can hold it against gravity. So that means that it can make it available to plants, and it also means that it can dissolve these minerals that are in the particles, right? It can make the phosphorus and the potassium and that available, and it can retain those nutrients, right? So that's basically what the first, I call that the primary processes. And then the secondary process is when the organisms come in, right? So plants first. So what do plants do? They take carbon and nitrogen out of the air. There's a lot of nitrogen in the air. You're currently breathing 78% nitrogen in and out, and you're doing nothing with it. You're taking the oxygen, but you're not doing anything with it. We call that non-reactive nitrogen. Plants can make nitrogen basically reactive and use it. Especially legumes can do that. So the plants come in, they capture the nitrogen and the carbon out of the air and put the carbon in a high energy form. That's why you can burn biomass, right? And so the soil then retains that carbon and the nitrogen, and because the plants also take up those other minerals, the phosphorus, the calcium, etc., and then it retains that and it becomes a reservoir for nutrients and energy, and then in addition, water. Okay, and that basically supports terrestrial life as we know it, right? It supports the plants, it supports the animals, it supports the humans, right? We are made of soil, right? Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. We are made of soil, okay? And so that's the beauty of the system, and this is really what life on Earth relies on. So soil is also alive. There's a lot of organisms in the soil. It's actually probably the richest medium for organisms. A lot of our medication actually comes from soil. Lots of bacteria, fungi, insects, earthworms, and they all rely on this ultimate source of energy, the carbon, the organic matter that's in the soil, right, that they consume, and then in turn they consume each other. Right? It's a jungle down there. Everybody eats everyone else, right? But that's how the ecological system works, and that makes the nutrients available to plants and all of those kind of things, right? And we refer to that as the soil food web because it's a very complex set of interactions. And you know, earthworms are great for the soil. They ingest the soil, and the earthworm casts are very high in organic matter and all that, right? If you don't have these organisms, then you tend to have unhealthy soil. So this carbon, there's so much interest now in the carbon component, right? And in the nitrogen secondarily. So soils, as you can see here, in the bigger picture, they take in a lot of the carbon through photosynthesis. They store it in the soil through the roots or the decay of plant materials. And of course, through the ages, a lot of this energy and carbon was stored in fossil fuels that are, some of it may be way down there, that we're now burning off in our cars and our heaters and all that, which of course is a problem. But the idea is that, let's say at the field scale, there's a lot of cycling of this carbon going on, right? So there's carbon coming in through photosynthesis, and then it gets processed and decomposed and decays, and some of it gets taken up by plants, some of it respires out of the soil. So there's a lot of actually cycling going on. So the net effect is relatively small. And one of the things that we're trying to do with programs around carbon sequestration in soils is try to maximize how much goes in and minimize how much goes out, okay? So soils are a storage reservoir for carbon, nutrients, and secondarily also water, right? Takes in water, it stores the water like it's a sponge. And that then serves all these, what we call ecosystem services, that the processes, the biological, physical, chemical processes in the soil allow us to grow food. It retains water in the landscape so that not everything runs off. It supports biodiversity and all of those other ecosystem services. Okay, so those are the natural soils. And then we started to use the soils for agricultural development, which is good. We need to grow food. We need to eat like any other organism. But we realized that if we till the soil, has multiple benefits. It helps with seed germination, reduces weeds and all that, but it also stimulates the decomposition of the organic matter. You aerate the soil, and that releases nutrients. That's good, right? But at that point in time, you start to withdraw out of your bank account, right? So if you think of the soil as an account of carbon and nutrients, you're starting to draw out of that, right? So if you don't cycle enough of that back, you're starting to basically draw down, and that becomes a problem, okay? So just to give you a visual sense of good-looking soil and bad-looking soil, right? So healthy soil, so here you see it's dark, right? That means it's a lot of organic matter. You see that it's alive, right? There's an earthworm in there. You also see that it has a lot of large pores and aggregates, which is really good for the soil. It allows for water transmission and aeration and things like that. The one on the right there is a not so healthy soil. What do you see there? You see more of the minerals because you don't see the organic matter, which is black. You see that it's very compacted and very dense, and it clearly doesn't seem to be very alive, right? So this is soil that's been very intensively managed. So just to give you a nice picture comparison from a study that I was involved with Rebecca Snyder in Natural Resources, looking at grasslands. This is some soil from Nebraska. On the left is soil from a prairie remnant, the natural soil, and on the right is one that has been farmed for 100 years. You see the same thing, much less organic matter, much less aggregation, more compacted soil, right? That's what has happened to many of the soils around the world over the years. Now, I want to talk a little bit historically, but also about the spatial dimension, right? So when we talk about how soils develop, we think of it sort of in place, or we say that in situ, okay? But there's actually a lot of spatial stuff going on. There's soil material moving around from one place to another through erosion, by leaching of nutrients. And one prime example, have you ever thought about why in Egypt, along the Nile Valley, they've had thousands of years of continuous crop production? How is that possible, right? In most other parts of the world, this is before there was fertilizers or any technology. Well, the primary reason is that when you have a large river basin like the Nile that goes all the way down to East Central Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and the White Nile and the Blue Nile come together. Blue Nile comes out of Ethiopia. And so there's, over the years, there's been little bits of carbon and nutrients that erode into the streams that end up in the Nile and then end up getting deposited as sedimentary material in the Nile Valley and the Delta. Right? So one of the great things about the Nile Valley was that there was this annual flooding as a result of the monsoons here in the upper part of the basin that ended up slowly moving and flooding the lower part of the basin, or the northern part of the basin, right? And so this basically sustained, this leached out the salts, and it sustained the agricultural production and the fertility of the soils, because there was little bits of carbon and nutrients that always got deposited. So that means, many, many years of fertile soils and good production of crops, not without problems. There were years of famine, of course, and due to climate events or pest outbreaks, but by and large, continuous crop production. Okay, and this is the same in Mesopotamia, in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, in what's now India and Pakistan, and along the Yellow River and the North China Plain. These were areas where civilizations developed. This is where hierarchies developed. This is where militaries were established. This is where slavery was developed, because a lot of this work was hard work, and people started to, and a lot of that has been described actually in the scriptures. Okay, but there's in these confluence zones, there's a natural accumulation of the basic ingredients of soil health, which is carbon, nutrients, and water. Now, another interesting example is the Valley of Mexico. So where the Mexica culture, or Aztec culture, developed. So here is the Lake Texcoco. Here is the ancient city of Tenochtitlan. Here is Teotihuacan. But this is also a confluence zone. This is an area where you had volcanic rocks, you had a valley that was not drained, where a lake developed, and there was a constant supply of carbon and nutrients into this swamp area, where these very high organic soils developed, very highly fertile soils, right? And so in this area, they built canals, and they heaped up the soil between the canals, and they had some of the best soils around, very fertile. And this basically allowed this culture to establish itself. And anybody know, this is a quite large city these days? Anybody know? It's the city of Mexico City, right? This has all been drained by the Spanish, and there's no more lake there. You can go on a little, there's only a lake, this lake Xochimilco, I think it's, where you can still go on a boat and you can look at the Chinampas, okay? But again, a confluent zone where the basic ingredients of soil health converge. Now, that's where the initial emphasis was, and even in this area here, a lot of the pre-Columbian settlements here were along streams or along our lake, Cayuga Lake, right? Because that's where the water was, that's where the nutrients were. But then as the world population expanded, we increasingly started to put land into production that maybe was pastures before, but we started to till it up, right? Because we needed to feed more and more people, right? 10 billion people probably in a couple of decades we have to feed, right? So some of these areas, these are natural divergent zones. These are areas that naturally would lose carbon and nutrients rather than gain them, like in these valleys. Right, and they're much more susceptible to erosion, things like erosion, because they tend to be on hillsides, or even on plains. They may lose a lot of the nutrients, right? And so in the U.S., of course, we have the central part of this country, which is still a major grain belt, but things are slowly degrading in terms of the soils. So this area here, what you see here in the dark, these are what they call these black soils. They are some of the best soils, and they tend to be grassland-derived soils. Okay, so those are some of the best and the most productive soils outside of those confluent zones, outside of the valleys and the deltas. Okay, now what's interesting, of course, is in terms of what you see on the news these days, yeah, these are very fertile soils in an area where we're currently seeing a conflict, right? And so this is creating a big issue around food production, because these are areas that export food to other areas, right? Ukraine exports a lot of wheat to Egypt, for example. Egypt no longer can feed its own people, too many people per unit land, right? So even these highly valuable fertile soils are degrading. Okay, and the way I'm going to try to explain why that is, all right? So one of it has to do with the changing structure of agriculture. So in sort of the early agriculture, you had quite a bit of integration. The primary producers, which is the plants, relying on the soil, they would feed the humans and they would feed the animals. And it was typically in a system where there was quite a bit of cycling of the nutrients and the carbons, because they were more or less self-containing farms, okay? Now with urbanization, starting maybe with the Romans, but of course much accelerated in the past couple of centuries, we see a disconnect between the carbon and the nutrients that are from the farms that then are being shipped to the urban areas, right? So some of the cycling is not happening. The cycling is still happening on the farm, right? The animals are still returning the manure and all that, but some of what that goes to the urban areas is not being returned. Now we have this situation, what we might call modern or more industrial agriculture, where we have specialization. We have specialized crop farms, and we have specialized animal farms, and then we still have the urban areas. So a lot of the crops go to other farms that are distant, sometimes even across the globe, and the carbon and the nutrients, that manure from the animals, is not coming back from China. Okay, and I'll explain that later. So now we have this huge disconnect, And that actually has a profound impact on food production and the quality of the land. All right, so we have more flow, less cycling. All right, and that's just due to economic forces. Now, you can make up for some of these nutrients because there's been some innovations over the years. There's about an 80-year period from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s where there were some major innovations. The first one was that von Liebig, a German, basically he found out how plants are getting their nutrition. He identified the major nutrients: phosphorus, potassium, calcium, etc., boron. So he figured out that this is all happening sort of at the elemental level. John Laws, an Englishman, found a way to take phosphate rock, treat it with sulfuric acid, and create phosphorus fertilizer, right? And then, notably, Fritz Haber, he found a way to take all the nitrogen in the air, right, and then to have a very intensive, energy-intensive process, but to create reactive nitrogen that the plants could take up and that they could use to make bombs as well. And then Bosch, Carl Bosch, then found a way to commercialize that, and now we refer to that as the Haber-Bosch process, right? So the huge amounts of energy goes actually to the production of ammonia around the world, okay? They use natural gas now. And then, so the Haber-Bosch process gave the Germans during World War I a strategic advantage because they were able to produce more bombs, basically, because it requires a lot of nitrogen than the Allied troops. And but then after World War II, same story, but now the Allied troops, had figured out they built their own plants. But then we had this huge overcapacity of bomb-making capacity that then could be repurposed for fertilizer. So after World War II, we saw this tremendous increase in the use of fertilizer in agriculture and through the repurposing of that manufacturing infrastructure. So what's the impact of that on the soils, right, you might ask? So let's go back to a natural system. In a natural system, maybe grassland, it may be forest, may be grazed. Most of the carbon and nutrients is being recycled, right? It may be leaf litter, maybe a tree that's blown over, it may be grass that died at the end of the years, decaying, the roots that may be decaying, may have gone through an animal, maybe a bison or some other animal, but most of it gets recycled. So in my little silly cartoonish way, we have a happy earthworm there because there's a lot of carbon and nutrients. This is where we've gone now. We've gone to a lot of specialized crop production, vast areas of this country, but also Ukraine, Russia, many other places, have gone to cash crop production, right? So these are grain production systems. Now, when you harvest a crop like corn or soybeans or wheat, you remove a very large part of the carbon and nutrients because that's in the grain. You harvest the grain and then you sell that somewhere else. It goes off the farm, right? And that may be 50 to 80%, depending on you talk about carbon or nutrients. And so very little of it gets returned. Think of like when you grow cabbage, for example, you harvest almost the entire plant, right? And then you sell it somewhere else. The carbon doesn't come back. If you grow soybeans or corn, you at least leave some of the residue on the field typically, okay? And then you combine that with erosion and maybe CO2 losses from tillage, and now you have a system that's really stressed because there's not enough carbon, therefore not enough energy, and also not nutrients that are being cycled. And so our little earthworm is pretty nervous, okay? This is not really a healthy soil system. Now, of course, like I said, the nutrients can be replaced. They can be replaced with synthetic fertilizers. But the ingredient that's lacking in synthetic fertilizers is the carbon, right? Doesn't mean that synthetic fertilizers are bad. I think there's a little bit of a misconception about the fertilizer being bad. It's just the fertilizer doesn't include something that the soil still needs, and that's the carbon, the organic material. That's why organic fertilizer like manure or compost is better for the soil than straight chemical fertilizer, okay? So that component, and we're only really realizing that now at a grand scale. Organic farmers kind of knew that all along, right? But that's where we are now. So when we did that for decades, when we developed the agriculture in the central part of the country, that was not sustainable, right? Because especially at that time, it was difficult because there were no fertilizers available. So in the 1930s, this country got a wake-up call, right? The Dust Bowl. We all know the history of the Dust Bowl. And it was basically because the soils slowly had degraded over a matter of decades. And then we got 6-7 years of unusually dry growing seasons, okay, as part of the climate fluctuation. And then we got the Dust Bowl, right? And that was a wake-up call. And that sort of generated the whole soil conservation movement, establishment of the Soil Conservation Service. County soil and water conservation districts were all established in the 1940s, okay? So that was an important part, but it was a wake-up call. It was a true wake-up call. Now, where are we now? Okay, now we're part of a global agricultural system. All right, so this is a map from Rabobank, the largest agricultural lender. What does this map tell you? If you look at the main global commodity crops, soybean, corn, wheat, what do you see here? Where does it come from mostly? The Americas, right? Where does it go to mostly? East Asia, right? And so, so why is that? Well, a lot of these East Asian countries have high population density. Some of them, like Japan, are very mountainous countries. There's not a lot of flat land. If you go to Japan, you'll see some rice paddies in the suburbs, right? And because they have so little flat land and that most of it is built up, they don't have the capability to support the population with the land base that they have. Okay, same with Korea. China has a very large population. It has a lot of agricultural land, but it also has a very large population. I'll come back to that in a minute. You know, and then you see things like, you know, Western Asia and Eastern Europe, where you have all these good soils, where you see a lot of, say, wheat production or sunflower production being, you know, going either into Western Europe or maybe to places like Egypt and all that. So the way you need to look at that is when you're shipping all these grains, you're shipping the basic ingredients of soil health, carbon, nutrients, and to some extent water as well, because it took water to grow these crops, right? So the Americas, US, Brazil, to lesser extent Argentina, Uruguay, are basically shipping the basic ingredients of soil health to the other side of the world in massive amounts, massive amounts. So this is just soybeans. So soybean is sort of the ultimate global commodity crop, right? So a lot of that goes to China. Why is that? Well, China grows about half the pigs in the world. And a lot of these are grown or raised by relatively small farms. So China has a policy, same as Denmark and the Netherlands, the country of my birth, where they want to keep small farmers in business. And if you have a small farm with little land, the best way to keep them in business is to intensify on the livestock. And if you don't have enough land, then you just import the feed. You take it from somewhere else. Well, most of that is soybean coming from the US and Brazil, right? So here's some graphics. US, Brazil, primarily producers, then Argentina, and then China, and then secondarily the EU are the primary importers, okay? So it's part of it is policy. The Chinese, in addition, decided to focus on the basic food grains because they had this historical experience during the Cultural Revolution of famine. 3 million people died in China due to famine in the 1960s. So they have this policy around protecting the basic food grains, and the feed grains, the ones that go to the animals, mostly get imported. Okay? So that's the system that we have now. Again, we're exporting the basic ingredients of soil health, right? Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but we should be aware of the fact that this is what's happening and we need to make up for it, right? So we're drawing out of the bank account. How do we put more carbon and nutrients back into the system? This is a map that I got from Valentina. She's Valentina Rubio, who's one of my PhD students, and she's from Uruguay. And Uruguay is very interesting because the natural ecosystem there is the pampas, is a grassland system, and mostly was used for grazing and animal production. Now, because of the global demand in soybeans especially, they've had this massive change in soybean production. So a lot of the grasslands that were very sort of sustainably managed, you might say, went to soybeans, right? And now they're growing row crops, and most of the carbon and nutrients are now exported, probably also to China and Europe, okay? So, and so Valentina did some research, I'm not showing any graphs, on what that means in terms of degradation of soil health. And basically, the Argentinians and Uruguayans are about 4 decades behind what we have here in the US in terms of the changes going from a corn, soybean, or soybean-based system, okay? Now, soybeans, you might say that's a great crop because it's a legume, it doesn't require nitrogen fertilizer, but soybean also produces very little biomass. It's a really relatively small plant, okay? So it doesn't really help feed the carbon in the soil very well. So soybean is a very controversial crop from my perspective, okay? Now, here's another example, maybe at a more local level. This is from India, where they're growing rice. And you can see that this soil doesn't look too great, right? It looks pretty compacted. Because they're growing the rice, but they're also not only do they take the grain, but they also harvest the straw, and then they feed that to their cows. You know, in India, there's a lot of cows, typically 1 or 2 cows per small farm. It's low quality feed. It's actually not good. It emits a lot of methane, which is a problem as well. And then what comes out the back end of the cow, these pies, are basically dried, and then they use them for cooking, right? So there's no carbon and nutrients going back into the soil. Now, they apply fertilizer, but they're not getting the carbon back, right? So that's why the soil ends up looking like this. In other parts of India, they're burning their crop residues, right? Causes huge amounts of problems with air pollution. But again, they're burning off the carbon that they need to keep their soils healthy, okay? So these are the kind of things that are happening, and that's why we see all these challenges. Now, humans are ingenious, right? And so over the centuries, there's been some approaches to actually reverse that, right? And one of the examples of that is the so-called plug-in soil or plug-in ash soils in Northwest Europe, where I come from. So what farmers did, it's very ingenious. They were farming very sandy, poor soils, very low in nutrition. But they had animals, mostly sheep, maybe some cattle. And what they did is they let the animals graze over grass, heath-type vegetation for a large area. And what they did then, at night they brought the animals to the homestead, and they had them in the barn. And what do the animals do at night? They urinate and they defecate, right? And so they let the animals concentrate the carbon and the nutrients, on the farm, and then they applied that in a relatively small area to build up the soil, build the organic matter, and that's where they grew their crops, right? So they used the animals to concentrate the carbon and the nutrients. In Brazil, the Terra Preta de Indio, kind of the same, this is in the Amazon, kind of the same idea. But there was a lot more char in the soil, and the char is very stable in the soil. So we now see char that maybe was from biomass from maybe 800 years ago that's still in the soil. And this got a lot of people interested in biochar. Like my colleague Johannes Lehmann here has done a lot of interesting work on that. Coastal areas where there was a lot of fishing, where we see an accumulation of carbon and nutrients because they would gut the fish and all that, and they would kind of throw it somewhere, and they actually build up the soil in some of these coastal areas. But I think what's important to point out is that many modern organic farms basically do the same, right? They take carbon and nutrients from a larger area, and typically they compost it, and they bring it onto their fields. And just to give you an example of that, this here, I took this a couple of weeks ago when I was going for a walk with my wife. This is Cornell's composting site. What does Cornell do? We have a lot of food scraps, food waste. It takes that food waste, combines it with wood chips, local wood chips, and it creates compost that is then being used on campus, right? So the institution is basically taking carbon and nutrients that may come from anywhere the food comes. Maybe it's broccoli out of California or oranges from Florida or whatever, and we're bringing that to campus, we're feeding the students and everyone else, and then the remnants are then being used and recycled. So we're concentrating the carbon and nutrients onto our campus. We're doing it. And that's what organic farmers do as well, right? This is a picture, same idea. This is from India, where farmers are using vermicomposting of their chicken manure, okay? So again, it's a spatial kind of concentration of the basic ingredients of soils. Okay, so let's briefly talk a little bit about agronomic management. So this is a concept that's really important for the book. And the concept is basically that you build resiliency, right? So you have a long-term idea of preventive management. You build the health in the soil so that you can make the whole system resilient, right? It's a little bit like you living a healthy lifestyle. You eat well, you exercise, and all the things that make you healthy, right? And then you can deal sort of with the in-season situation where you try to take the best resources available, the right seed and all that, have the right equipment, and then you may need to do some reactive management, right? So the system is not perfect, but you build some resiliency in the system, right? It's like with humans, you're healthy so that when you have some adverse event, like a global virus that comes along, you are better to deal with it, right? If you're healthy. So that same approach, so it's a long-term approach. So dealing with soil health is a long-term management approach. So what are some of the principles that you use to do that? Well, you cycle the organic materials, the residues, the manure, etc. You enhance the biomass production. There's no use in growing crops if they're not doing well. You're not capturing the solar energy and the nutrients. So enhancing crop production, good yields, good crop genetics, etc. And you reduce the disturbance. And you cover the soil and you maintain living plants as much as possible so that you optimize the carbon and the nutrients. So I just want to show you this picture because I just love this picture. Going back to what's now Mexico City. And that's, if you go to the Palacio Nacional, you see these beautiful murals by Diego Rivera. And they depict, for example, the pre-Columbian agricultural system. It's mostly based on corn, squash, and beans, the three sisters. And they basically used a no-till system. They used planting sticks, they didn't do any plowing, right? So the early populations of this part of the world were no-tillers. They did a good job with that, right? And then, of course, as depicted by Rivera, then the Europeans came in and they said, oh, you're doing it all wrong. You need to plow the soil, and that's a better way to do it, right? And of course, now we know that the indigenous population had it figured out better than the Europeans. And of course, he depicts all the associated enslavement and all that goes with that. Okay, so there are many technologies now that we have to sort of achieve these goals. So don't think that we need to go back to old-style agriculture. We need to use some of the principles that maybe have been used in the past, which are based on ecological principles, understanding the ecological processes. But we need to also have the technology to use these principles in an efficient way, because we do now have 8 billion people, right? It's not like 100 years ago. So a lot of interesting technology has been developed for tillage, cover cropping, a lot of those things, planting green, which is the one that's here. And what we see is that when we, here's one graph. I do have actually one graph. So what we see is that we often have an additive effect. If we reduce tillage, we have a benefit. If we use a cover crop, we have a benefit. If we combine them, we have an even greater benefit, right? So the productive capacity of the soil can be significantly increased if you bring some of these practices together. And that's what the book is really all about, okay? So a big part of the book is explaining how to do that. So I wanted to point this out. So there's posters in the back there. So Joseph Amsili, who works with me, and Sandra Wayman and Matt Ryan developed this poster, and it shows how much of the biomass of cover crops is actually underground that you don't even see, right? So these roots are so important to maintaining the health of the soil, right? So this is a wonderful poster. You can have one for free. You can take it with you. That shows how important the roots are in the system. Also, animals are important. I mentioned that they are part of the cycling of the carbon and nutrients. So there's a big debate here in society about, whether we should eat animal products or not. Right? Part of the problem is that the way we raise animals now is not a good way. It's not sustainable, but it doesn't mean that the animals are necessarily bad or that they couldn't be part of a sustainable system, because they can help cycle the nutrients and the carbon in the system, right? Through good rotational grazing or silvopastoral systems where you graze the animals and with trees, or marginal lands that maybe otherwise would not be used for agricultural production, where you can have sheep or goats or animals that can survive in that kind of situation. And then cycling the organic materials and the manures back onto the land, right? So animals can be a very beneficial part of the system. So as part of our soil health program, one of the things that we decided was that we needed to measure soil health, right? So we developed a new framework, comprehensive assessment of soil health framework, that allowed us to look more holistically at the health of the soil. Not just look at the chemicals, the potassium and the phosphorus and the pH, but look at the biology and the physics of the soil as well. And I think that this has been really useful. We've learned so much. A lot of the things that I was just talking about, we learned by measuring these things and using a test like that. If you're interested in that, that's a publication on our website that you can download. So Sarah mentioned this digital technology that I've also been involved with. And so when we have more complex crop production systems, more multi-objective, right, where it's not only about producing a crop, but it's also about storing carbon or improving the water relationships in the landscape or reducing greenhouse gas losses. So when we bring in these management practices, so-called sustainable management practices like cover cropping and reduced tillage, it changes the nutrient management as well, right? And that's really this tool that we developed, ADAPT, and it takes into account different cropping practices and brings that together to adjust your nutrient management. And this is for nitrogen, which is particularly sensitive. If you have a cover crop in the system, you need to change your nitrogen management. If you have manure in your system, you need to change your nitrogen management, right? And digital technology can do that. So again, it's not going back to old style agriculture, it's going to better agriculture, and some of these technologies can help us get there. Now the final chapter of, no, actually not the final chapter, but one of the chapters that was new about the 4th edition that was not in the previous edition was a chapter on urban soil health, the urban setting. And so I mentioned that Cornell brings in the carbon and the nutrients from all the food waste and concentrates it here onto campus, right? And it's being used for good purposes. And so if you go out here onto the quad, or you can, the Century Garden and all that, yeah, right there, beautiful lush vegetation, beautiful plantings, or what we call green infrastructure, right? And we have, of course, urban agriculture as well, urban farming. But this is so I want to kind of do a little shout out to Nina Basek, who retired this last month out of the horticulture department. I've been a big fan of Nina because she has done so much for especially the CALS part of the campus in terms of the beautification. So all this beautiful vegetation that you see in front of Mann Library, in front of Warren, in front of of Kennedy and Roberts and going that way along Tower Road. That was all using the compost material that the campus has and enhancing the soil and having these beautiful plantings. Typically, or I think almost all of it was through this course that she teaches. So there are ways to use the carbon and the nutrients most efficiently and then enhance the quality of the soil, enhance either the aesthetics or enhance the food production and make it more healthy. Okay, so Nina, thanks for all your great work. It was wonderful working with you. So this is my last slide, and this is bringing it back to Mann Library. So there was sort of you might say, a proto version of Building Soils for Better Crops. And that was a book that was published by Jethro Tull. Now, some of you of a certain age know Jethro Tull as a band, right? The band was named after the maybe early agricultural scientist. He was an Englishman, and his name was Jethro Tull. So Tull actually did some experimentation, and he made some major contributions to agriculture production. One of them is that he invented the mechanical seeder. He realized that throwing seeds onto the ground was very inefficient. The birds would eat it, and it would be more difficult to weed and all that. So he said, like, well, if we put the seeds in a row, then and we put them in the ground, then they germinate better. And if they're in a row, it's a little easier to control the weeds because you can just hoe between the rows, right? That's why he called the book The Horse Hoeing Husbandry. He also believed that you should pulverize the soil because he said, oh, then you don't need manure. You have all the nutrients. That was not a good idea because, he was mining the soil, right? But he also had some good ideas about rotations and soil improvement crops. The reason why I'm bringing that up, not only in the historical context, because Mann Library has a first edition of this book, yay! And it's here in this building. It's also in electronic format in the...
Hockey Trust or Biodiversity Heritage Library or Hockey Trust?
Okay. So ask the Mann Library folks. One of the more interesting experiences that I had was to go to this special collection. What do you call them?
Rare distinctive collections.
Yeah, distinct. And the book is there, and they will actually allow you to look at the book. They'll give you, I think, white gloves, right? It used to be that they'll give you some white gloves because this was published in 1731. So you do the math. That's now almost 300 years ago, right? So if you really want an exciting experience, and they'll let you go ask them if you can see the copy of the first edition right at the best agricultural library at any university in the world, right? That's Mann Library. So with that, this is my last slide. So thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions or comments?
I guess I have a question about the soil health rating. How do you put a value on so many different variables that might show, like their importance might differ so drastically in different settings and production systems? What was your process in creating that rating, and how do you create a rating that is flexible enough to not overgeneralize and not
Maybe I should go back.
When you have a rating that's so broad and loose,
Right.
How do you do it in a way that isn't overgeneralized?
Yeah, and that's a real challenge. It's a good question. So when we developed this framework, so the first question was, what are good indicators of soil health, right? So we selected 4 physical, 4 biological, and we had basically 7 chemical indicators that were part of the standard, the old soil test, you might say. So that was the first task. And then the second task was, how do you interpret the numbers? Because we were measuring indicators that hadn't really been widely measured, right? And so we used kind of a peer group evaluation approach, where we just went out and we sampled a lot of soils, first in this part of the world and later in other parts of the world too. and we said, and then we got a sense of the range, right? So an indicator like active carbon, 200 is a low value, 800 is a high value, right? So this is a little bit like when you have a blood sample taken and they measure your cholesterol or your potassium, right? They know what's the high value, what the low value is, and then so they can give you some interpretation, low, medium, high, or something like that, right? So that was the second challenge. And then what we also do is we give it this overall soil health rating, which is basically an unweighted average, right? So it doesn't take into account that maybe in some production system, one indicator might be more important than another, right? And so that we leave that up. We basically say don't pay too much attention to this. Pay attention to the individual indicators. For example, we find that with on dairy farms in this part of the world, where they grow a lot of corn silage. So with corn silage, you're harvesting the entire plant, right? For those of you who know about agriculture, and that goes to the barn, and some of it comes back as manure. We found that many of these indicators look great on these fields with corn silage, except one, and that's the aggregate stability. The aggregates are weak, and we see a lot of runoff and erosion coming from those fields. That's very different than, say, a organic vegetable farm or a corn soybean operation, okay? So when you measure it, you understand it better. And that's why we focused on that. And we will probably have a cash 2.0 at some point in time, kind of working on that. But it was already just eye-opening to be able to see that if you measure it, you had some improvement. Some of you may know Klaas Martens. He's a very famous organic farmer in the Penyan area. And he was one of our earlier collaborators. And he's an organic farmer, very famous. And we actually went to his fields, and his soil health test did not come back very, very well. It was almost embarrassing. It's like, oh, Klaas, he's like Klaas Martens, he works with Dan Barber, the famous chef, and all that. And so we were like, well, we kind of let it go. And then a few years later, he cornered me. He said, that was really good. You really got me going. I thought I had it all figured out. But because your soil health data didn't come out so well, I realized what was lacking. And so he started actually partner with some of the beef farmers in his area and trying to get some of the manure onto his fields, because he was mostly growing grain crops. He was doing it organically, but it was still not good enough. And then he realized, oh, I need to still improve my system. So that's what you learn when you start to measure things. First, our first reaction was in those cases like, oh, there must be something wrong with our test. And it's like, no, it doesn't mean, like if you have an organic farm, it doesn't necessarily mean that the test should always come out well, right? Let's see how the numbers are, and maybe there is something lacking, even though we thought that they had the right system. So that's been interesting. Yeah. Louis? Yeah.
And I was wondering, what is the role of trees? I remember growing up, my grandmother, who died at 106, she was pissed off when she saw people planting trees like in the countryside, because she remembered how hard it was, like to take the roots out, to like remove the trees from the agricultural landscape. And I wonder, could trees have like a role to get the nutrients that are deeper in the ground back at the surface?
Yeah, they could. Actually, most trees, especially around here, don't necessarily have very deep roots. They mostly go lateral. It's actually these deep-rooted grasses that are more effective, and they put on relatively more biomass. Even though you see a tree, you think like, oh, there's a lot of biomass. Well, it kind of accumulates over time. But grasses actually produce a lot of biomass, perennial grasses, I should say, produce a lot of biomass constantly, and there's a high turnover of the roots. So you're actually better off, having grasses like these cover crops that of the poster that I just showed. So and trees are. You can't really remove the stumps that easily. So there's probably probably a lot of the labor was part of that. So there maybe was were some reasons for that, yeah. So that's why I think we've learned a lot about, sort of the ecologically based management approaches that sort of maximize the amount of carbon and nutrients and the health that we get out of the soils for that reason, yeah. Yeah.
Harold, I see the solar farms and the sheep, and I've never thought of it in these terms, but could an argument be made that a solar farm on, former agricultural land, not cutting down trees, with that sheep, with a pastoral, is actually also a soil amending, soil improving?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually very interesting. So I'm actually involved with a project with Max Zhang. He's in engineering. And there's some people here, Mike Toney, who was in animal science, who unfortunately passed. So there's a lot of opportunity around what we call agrivoltaics, right? So we need to generate energy, renewable energy, and solar is big for that, especially when you go, further towards the tropics. So animals, grazing animals, fit very well with that because you don't have to mow, and they'll find their way. Sheep especially, and so that allows you, and it's not being tilled, so it allows you to enhance the soil. There's also a lot of interest in having young farmers or new farmers use some of these solar sites because there's still enough solar radiation coming in where they can grow, where somebody can grow crops like, organically grown, kale or something like that. So there's a lot of interest in combining solar generation with crop production. And this actually came up, I was in India just a few weeks ago as part of a project with the Tata Cornell Initiative. And it focuses on zero hunger, zero carbon. And what I noticed was that there was very little solar in India. And you're sort of like, wow, this is a country where they have a lot more solar energy than we do. So when we go back to that situation, remember that I showed these cow pies, that the manure that's being used for fuel for cooking. Well, if they do more electrification, they have more local production of electricity, keeping those resources there. There's a lot of sort of marginal land that could be used for solar production. India heavily relies on coal-fired power plants, so when you think about reducing the carbon footprint, it's making sure that no new coal-fired power plant is being built. And then using the marginal land, maybe it can be used for grazing still between the solar panels. So there's a lot of opportunities with solar to still have agricultural production, to bring resources to poor communities. And I'm not saying, typically it's not the farmers who start to develop the solar farms, it's somebody coming out from the outside and they lease the land, but it's resources coming to that community. It was interesting because we talked to someone and they said, there's a lot of climate change related issues in India. It's very, they had a terrible heat wave. And you go to places there and you think like, they just had a cooling center here. They just had the electricity, one air conditioner, so that people could go to the cooling center when you have these extreme heats. In the state of Bihar, 462 people, I believe, were killed during this recent heat wave. If people just have some alternatives, right? So we need to look also at energy production as part of farming, right? Not only farming for crops or animals, but also farming energy, right? It's still the same thing. You're still farming solar energy, basically, right? That's what you do with plants. So I think there's a real opportunity, especially in less developed countries, to think about more broadly about how you use the landscape and how solar energy has a place, wind energy maybe as well, but especially solar, can help, improve the communities, but also helps the functioning of the landscape and the health of the soil and food production. So that's sort of like the leading edge of our thinking, right? So yeah, we need to be more creative. So I think the agrivoltaics, I initially thought that was kind of a strange idea, and then I really thought about it more. It's like, yeah, this makes some sense, especially in other places, where there's a lot of intensive land use. it kind of combines with demographics. So in places like India, you talk to a farmer and you ask him, how many siblings do you have? And they say, well, 6, 7, 8. How many children do you have? 2 or 1, right? And this is a farmer maybe my age. And then you ask him, well, who's going to take over the farm when you want to retire? And the person then says, like, well, not my daughter, she's a teacher, she's got a good job. Not my son, he works in tech. And so a lot of these people are going to get out of farming. There's going to be consolidation of land, and there's going to be new opportunities with that. It's not necessarily a bad thing if we start consolidating some of that land. Now, we've overdone it in this country a little bit. But there's some interesting opportunities. When you think 10 years, 20 years down the line, there's going to be some changes that are happening in demographics, in agricultural technology, and it's going to be, I think, an exciting time. I hope to hang in there a little bit longer to be able to take it. She's laughing at me, my wife. All right, sorry, that was a long answer, sorry. Mary, yeah?
Do you have any thoughts on some of the new biologicals that are coming out as potential replacement for nitrogen fertilizers?
Yeah, my general thought is that they make more sense if you need them. If you have a system that cycles carbon and nutrients very well, I don't think you have much of a need for it. Otherwise, you may have, it may stimulate some biological activity. It may, so it sort of depends a little bit. I don't think it's a panacea, and I think it's sort of, in certain, I've seen it work very well in certain environments, and I've seen in other environments where, well, it doesn't really make any difference. There's a company, Pivot Bio. Maybe you're familiar with them, and they're really promoting that. I've seen some very mixed results from that. And they have a clever marketing approach. I won't go into. I'll be happy to share my thoughts on that. But yeah, so I think that there's potential. I haven't seen anything overly dramatic around that quite yet. Yeah. You had a question as well.
I missed why carbon is so important in soil health. And what about using paper and cardboard to put more of that in the soil? Or as an extension to maybe really jumpstart it to buy granulated carbon and add it to soil?
Yeah, so carbon is important because it's organic matter. If you want to build organic matter, you need carbon and other nutrients, because organic matter is 58% carbon. That's what it is. It's 10%. No, it's like 5% nitrogen. So if you want to build the organic matter in the soil to support the life in the soil, you need to have that carbon. Now you could use things like, we use wood chips, right? We actually mulch with wood chips, and you could use cardboard for that matter as well. One of the concerns about using carbon or material that's mostly carbon and very low in nutrients is that it can tie up some of the nutrients in the soil. So you have to be a little careful about what you're doing there. If you mulch it, it tends to be better. So for example, all the plantings around here, I was talking about Nina Basic, so they used compost to improve the soil, and they mixed it in, this scoop and dump method, as Nina calls it, and then you cover it with mulch, right? Mostly wood chips. And that's okay, but if you start to mix too much of the wood chips into the soil, you tie up some of the nutrients. And if you want to understand that, then read the book. It's a little complicated, but it basically has to do with biological process. The soil is the carbon and the nitrogen in the soil are converging on a certain ratio. It's about 10 to 1, 12 to 1, right? So if you put a lot of carbon into the soil, the organism will draw the nitrogen out, and then it won't be available for your plants. So it's a little, again, it gets a little technical. But yeah, so yes, the answer is yes, but be careful what you're doing, yeah.
So I work with a lot of urban vegetable producers. And so when I talk about like cover crops, the hardest thing is like incorporating it into the existing rotation. Like a lot of like what we grow, like start as early as like late April all the way to October. So it's like hard to like fit back. Like, you have any suggestions or?
Yeah, so it really depends on what your main crop is, right? So if you're growing a main crop that's a full season crop, like corn, for example, or soybean, then you have short windows either at the beginning of the growing season and the end of the growing season. So typically the way to handle that is to have a crop like, or cover crop like cereal rye that is a cool season crop. It will still grow. If you seed it now, you'll still get some biomass out of that. Actually, if you're interested in cover crops, we have a whole demonstration at Caldwell Field on the upper part of campus. But some other crops, like for example, if you're growing spinach or peas, right, you grow them in the early part of the season, and then you can have a mid-season cover crop, right? That wouldn't be cereal rye. You would have something else, maybe buckwheat or something like that. So it depends a little bit on what your cash crop is and how you can then fit in a cover crop to help build the soil. So you can have an early spring cash crop like spinach or peas, then you can grow a cover crop, and then you can have a late season cash crop, right? Maybe broccoli or something like that. So there are different ways. There's actually a wonderful book that's also sold by SARE. That's, what's it called? Managing Cover Crops Profitably, right? Yeah, that goes into that. There's a chapter on cover crops in our book as well, but there's a book that's much more comprehensive. Actually, some of my guys, Joseph notably, he did his master's work on cover crops. He's very knowledgeable. Yeah. All questions have been answered. So, and then there's a lot more questions that you can get answered in the book. So, yeah, maybe one last one.
Yeah, I guess I have a slightly contentious question that I don't know the answer to. So, oftentimes when researching on cover crops, and people are like, oh, well, this farming system can sequester carbon and help fight climate change. And I always don't know how to answer that question, because I recognize that certain farming practices can build organic matter in soil, but I also recognize that, whenever there's a soil disturbance event like tillage, there's a massive amount of carbon that's emitted into, the atmosphere. And so my question is, do you think that farming systems are set up in a way to sequester carbon enough to fight climate change? Or is this like a zero-sum game where you can build organic carbon, but it's never enough to actually stop or slow climate change?
No, I mean, definitely good farming practices can help fight, you might say, climate change. I mean, the idea is really to take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? Now, there's two other greenhouse gases, of course, that we're concerned about. One is methane, and the other one is nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide, that's where I did a lot of work, and we developed a technology for that, because we can use nitrogen much more efficiently, right? And methane, we can feed cows much better, or we can cover our storage lagoons, so methane as well. But just focusing on the carbon, so it is a little bit of a checkbook, you might say. So the more carbon you put into the system and the less you take out, right, you get a net benefit. So if you do tillage, then that's not good. That you tend to sort of stimulate decomposition. But a cover crop or a high biomass crop, like miscanthus, but also corn is a very high biomass crop, that can be beneficial, right? But you need to look at all of those components. What is, how much carbon are you getting? How much nitrogen is involved in nitrous oxides? But in general, cover crops are good, especially if you allow them to grow and attain a lot of biomass, right? If you grow a cover, I've seen farmers in this area, for example, they put in oats for a fall cover crop, and the oats get winter killed. in November, and they got these little sprouts out there, and it's like, that doesn't really help, right? But if you have, say, cereal rye, and it gets through the winter, and you allow it to attain some biomass, right, above ground and below ground, in the spring before you plant your next crop, then you have a lot of benefits, especially if the cover crop is allowed to mature a little bit, so it gets a little more stable carbon. It tends to benefit things as well. So there's a lot of research going on in that area. But I would say, yes, definitely lots of opportunities, but you kind of have to, there's cover crops, there's tillage, it's a lot of it is about the execution. How is it being executed to maximize that? And it's kind of a buzz thing these days, but people need to know what they're doing, and it needs to be verified. If you say, I'm storing carbon in the soil and reducing climate impact, okay, show me the numbers. Okay, that was the last question, so thanks very much.